Hello, I'm Michael Opitz, your host, and I want to welcome you to our third Internet radio broadcast. There are lots of good radio shows and even fewer TV shows that attempt to share accurate, in-depth news and relevant information. We're just citizens who are supported by a network of people who share information and stories that provide insight that is not offered by the big media. And this show is about sharing that information with a perspective of accurate facts and truth. Also, as the show progresses, I'll bring in special guests with their expert knowledge and unique perspectives on topics currently in the news. These discussions will not be superficial, and I think you'll find them very interesting. My guest host is Christina Jeffrey, Ph.D., political science professor, former House historian, and college professor. She's both smart and knowledgeable, and she is one of a small minority of conservative college professors. And shortly we'll bring in Garland Favorito, who is a voting machine expert. And his insight, I think you'll find more than interesting. So with that being said, there's been a lot of news today with shootings at the naval base there in Washington. We're not going to talk about that tonight as it's still unfolding, but what we are going to talk about briefly is Syria, Obama, John Kerry, and Putin, and that's quite a threesome. So some of the questions that I have and other people have had, was this whole event staged to bring in Putin and Russia, or are we just looking at an inept administration? Or does the administration just want to cause chaos? Are we looking at someone who's becoming emotionally unstable? All of those are questions, and we can't do an in-depth study on or discussion on the show tonight, but at least we can bring those topics to the air so we can begin that dialogue. Christina, do you have thoughts on that opening statement?
Well, my first reaction to a couple of those was no. Emotionally unstable. If it hadn't been for the big the big mistake of talking about your partisan objections to Republicans in Congress immediately after that shooting, I would not have entertained that question at all. But certainly there's huge insensitivity. I'm inclined to think that it's not emotional instability, but maybe a kind of narcissism that would make somebody so completely tone deaf. We're talking about the president, of course, who went on national TV to lambast the Republicans and try to blame them for trying to shut down the government, which, of course, they aren't doing. But the way the media covers the news, and sadly that includes Fox News in this case, because probably more people saw the president on Fox News than anywhere else, with the all of the mainstream media was focused on the naval yard and the shooting. So most people didn't even hear the president lambasting the Republicans. But if not, may not be emotional instability, but it's certainly tone deaf and insensitive.
I sent out, I'm president of Madison Forum, and you're a Madison Forum member. Matter of fact, all the folks that we have on the show tonight are Madison Forum members. But an article that I sent out today to Madison Forum distribution was a comparison between our president and Captain Quigg in Mutiny on the Bounty. And it really drew some interesting parallels. I don't know if you've had a chance to see that. But perhaps we'll publish it on decidingthevote.com. That's a new growing website for significant news and essays for events that are happening and events that may happen. But anyway, it's a thoughtful, intellectual, I hate to use the word intellectual website, but it's a place to go for good, valid knowledge. And it's not a place for knee-jerk reaction on issues. But to switch the topic, since we're
wait,
going to
just quickly before you switch the topic, when I was in graduate school studying organization theory, we had to read Mutiny on the Bounty, and I, at the age of 21, could not understand what that had to do with organizations or public administration or organization theory, but I have drawn on that so many times because it shows what happens if the leader of a democratic society, and even if the ship is probably as undemocratic as you can get in democratic times, if you are completely out of touch with the people you're leading, you cannot lead.
No, you can't. And I think that I made a misstatement when I said mutiny on the Bounty, but it's the Kane Mutiny.
The Kane Mutiny, that's right.
The Kane Mutiny. And the parallels of Captain Quigg's behavior is drawn very strongly to the captain of our ship of state. So, but with that, we need to transition to introductory discussion on voting machines, because Garland Favorito is coming up in just a few minutes, and I'd like to make sure that folks are on board with the issue before we jump right into the middle of it. It's interesting on these DRE machines, electronic voting machines that many states have been using, that they are inherently open to election fraud, because many of them do not have hard copies, ballots that then can be used for recounts. And if you can't do a recount, then you have to assume that there is fraud involved in the election. And a couple of countries that have made a major decision on this, both Germany and Ireland, have thrown out the electronic voting machines just for that reason. So, Christina, do you have any thoughts on electronic voting machines and the security of our votes?
I've been interested in this a long time, and I recall, I'm not sure, did we buy our used voting machines from Alabama in 2004, 5, or 6? I think it was 2005.
We didn't buy any, as far as I know.
Oh, yeah, you're Georgia.
Machines.
I'm South Carolina. South Carolina bought them used from Alabama. It was about 2005, and I was a little concerned about electronic voting, and I happened to run into the salesman at the airport, Spartanburg.
Tell us about that conversation.
Well, I was waiting for a plane, and these people I was waiting to meet a plane. No, I guess I must have been waiting for a plane too. And these people were all salesmen. They had just made a big sale to South Carolina. They were celebrating. They had a few, and they were in very good mood. And I saw this as a chance to find out something about the voting machines, since they were obviously in a very unguarded condition. And we just chatted for a while, and then, their plane was coming. They all got up at once to leave, and I said, just kind of a throwaway line, "So tell me something. Are those voting machines secure?" And the three men and the one woman started laughing their heads off as they walked out the door. And I have never forgot that. And Barbara Simons came to Wofford last year, and a lot of the voting people went to hear her. Wofford College.
Okay, good.
Liberal Arts College in Spartanburg. A lot of people who were pro electronic voting machines, people want to be in favor of what they have to use. They don't want to think that they're setting up machines that are going to misrecord the vote. So here are all the commissioners from our voting commission, and they think that this academic is going to tell them that everything's fine. Well, she did not tell them that. She told them the absolute opposite. And at the very end, a professor said, "So, Dr. Simons, tell me something. If this is so unsafe, why do you bank online? And she said, oh, yes, I bank online. It's very convenient. But if I lose money, the bank will give it back to me. But if you lose your vote, you can never get it back.
Ooh, that statement has strong impact, Christina.
Well, it did. I mean, people walked out of there shocked because now it has moved out of the conspiracy theory into it's a conventional Democrat liberal. I don't think she had any partisan interest at all. In fact, when you read the literature, the Democrats are as suspicious of the Republicans as the Republicans are of the Democrats, and that's one of the great terrible things, one of the many terrible things about using machines that you cannot verify. Nobody is ever honestly elected.
Well,
so nobody has that credibility.
Stalin's famous quote was, "It doesn't matter who votes. What only matters is who counts the votes." And that's a very sobering thought. Also, currently in the news, just this week, New York had an election. And what they used, they threw out the electronic voting machines and brought in their old mechanical voting machines, which evidently they stored. And
Good
that's
for
what
them.
they use because, as you mentioned, both sides are becoming equally suspicious of the other. And so they felt that was the only way they could get a fair and accurate vote by the use of old mechanical voting machines.
And this might be another example of what you referred to in your first question, chaos. The introduction of chaos.
Because if you're the one orchestrating the chaos, if you're the master of chaos, you know what's going on while all the people running around are still trying to figure it out.
That's right.
So with that, let me introduce Garland Favorito. And to tell you a little bit about Garland, I've been involved on the voting machine issue since 2002. Talking about it, I was appointed to the State Committee on Voting Machine Fraud to Randy Evans, who was at that time the GOP chair for the Republican Party. So Garland, I took it as far as I could in spreading information, sharing information. I thought it would be a no-brainer that people, once they understood the liability of these machines, it would be just common sense replacement. But after 10 years, I have found that that's not the case. Garland took this issue on voting machines and his expert knowledge. He is a technologist, and he is very familiar with all aspects of the voting machine. He took this case to the Fulton County Superior Court in Georgia, and the judge refused to rule on the evidence. Garland then appealed it to the Georgia State Supreme Court, and the Georgia State Supreme Court also refused to rule on the evidence. And consequently, we still have these DRE electronic voting machines in Georgia, and but more and more people are becoming concerned. And what we need to do is have the state legislators vote to throw them out. I've already talked extensively with our Secretary of State, Brian Kemp, on this subject, and he stated that it was not in his camp. The voting machines were not in his campaign platform, and nobody ever calls him on it. So with that, Garland, how are you this evening?
I'm sure
I'm
Garland never calls him.
Yeah, I've met Michael, and I have met with Brian several times, and didn't get very far. I'm doing great this evening, Michael. Thank you for having me, and Christina, it's great to talk with you again.
Always a pleasure.
I was thinking as y'all were talking about this, y'all have already covered so many good subjects, and I was thinking maybe up in South Carolina, we have a classic example up there. As y'all know, Georgia and South Carolina have unverifiable voting equipment statewide, as does Maryland. Probably the three worst states in the country. Georgia was ranked last in system reliability, and recount preparedness. But I thought you've got a great example up there, Christina, in the Alvin Green story.
Alvin Green.
Yeah. So I thought maybe I would talk a little bit about that, and just to start things off, and then we can go into a little bit about what's wrong with the machines and so on. But if y'all remember, just a couple of years ago, Alvin Green was running for the U.S. Senate in the Democratic primary, and he was running against a establishment candidate whose name was Vic Rawl. And Vic had gotten he was supported by the Washington Democratic establishment and was expected to be a shoo-in. And all of a sudden, when they conducted the election, Alvin Green had won by a landslide of almost 60 to 40%. I think it was over 60 to 40%. And there was just one problem with that. Alvin Green didn't have any campaign, didn't advertise, didn't have a website, didn't take any donations, didn't appear, I think, at any events, or maybe one or two. Wasn't even known by the Democratic Party establishment in the state, and somehow managed to walk away with a 60 to 40% landslide victory on the election day there in the primary. But if we look at the votes there, and I did some research a little bit for the Rawl campaign, Green had gotten 60 to 40% on the unverifiable electronic voting equipment. But when you looked at all the verifiable absentee ballot equipment, Vic Rawl had won the election 55 to 45%, a total turnaround. And that kind of raises a few questions.
It definitely does raise a lot of questions when doing any type of comparative analysis, especially if you have two different methods of comparison. The facts speak for themselves.
Well, the Democrat Party challenged their own primary, took it to court, and the media raised questions about whether or not the Republicans were responsible. And this is the kind of chaos that these unverifiable systems produce.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting that the party establishment there eventually decided that they needed to just get on with things and worry about beating Republicans, and not worry about who actually won their Democratic primary. I thought that was kind of strange.
That is strange.
Yeah.
Now the Republicans didn't challenge the election. The Democrats challenged it. They challenged their own primary.
Right. Vic Rawl challenged the primary, but the Democratic leadership decided that they'd rather go ahead and concentrate
on the Republicans. Yeah,
and beating Republicans than worry about whether or not they had actually elected the right candidates.
Yeah, the whole thing was very strange, and Barbara Simons, when she spoke at Wofford, referred to that as well.
So have any changes resulted, any voting machine changes, methodology of voting?
No.
Right.
There's been no change. We're using the same machines.
Why would the establishment, especially one that challenged the results of it, why wouldn't they make a concerted effort to change out the machine so we could have verifiable voting through a hard copy, which allows recounts? If you can't do a recount, you can't be assured that you have an honest election.
Well, in South Carolina, if you object to something, you're just told that you're just wrong. So drop it.
Right. Neither establishment party really wanted to take on that issue. Neither the Democrats or the Republicans. So
That's right.
It's just dropped, and I contacted the South Carolina State Election Board, and they just kind of blew the whole thing off, kind of wrote it off. They just couldn't explain it.
We have the same kind of problem here in Georgia with neither of the two major political parties wanting to challenge the use of potentially fraudulent electronic voting systems. As a matter of fact, one senior Republican Party official said to me not long ago, "Michael, why do you keep pushing for the replacement of these machines when we've won every constitutional election in the state?" I am a Republican, so I'll make that known, but I believe in fair and honest elections. You know, you never can tell when the other side gets in, or you never can tell when individuals have influence that we don't want them to have, and we know from the history of the world that individuals will corrupt elections given the opportunity.
Right, and just to show you that Alvin Green's situation is not just one unique situation. We had the same, very, very similar thing here in Georgia in 2010. We had a Georgia Supreme Court candidate who was running against in a three-way race against an incumbent, and she got 35% of the vote on election night. It was 733,770 votes. And she also did not have a campaign, didn't advertise, didn't have a website, didn't take donations, didn't respond to surveys or accept media requests, and really didn't even have her contact data registered correctly at the Secretary of State's office. So two amazing cases, just to show you that it wasn't even one isolated case, in two different states, both using statewide unverifiable voting equipment.
Yeah, no, there's something going on here that is beyond our being able to know the why, but we certainly can see the what.
That we can. And Garland, if you would also comment on another issue, it seems that Georgia has outsourced the tabulation of election voting to a third-party company located in Florida. It's called Seidel, but it's owned by a private company headquartered in Spain. Each of the counties send their electronic voting totals to Seidel in Florida, and Seidel mimics the website of our Secretary of State website. And so when I ran for office and I looked at the website, I think it was you who told me, he said, "Michael, that's not the website from the Secretary of State, that's Seidel." And everybody I've spoke with, that has come as a surprise to them. So we've got a third party tabulating our votes, and that also raises questions. And we paid them $250,000 to do this. There are 26 states that are now sending their votes to Seidel, to a Spanish-owned company. And what technology does a Spanish company have that we don't have in America, and we don't even have at a state level?
Well, that's right, Michael. And the company, the subsidiary of Seidel that's doing this is called SOE Software, and they're, as you said, they're out of Tampa, Florida. So the way this works is that the counties can they can offload their election publishing to Seidel or to SOE Software. And the way that works is they have to upload their election results to Seidel. And then, as you said, Michael, Seidel mimics the Secretary of State's website at the county level. So if you go into the county, and I think Cobb is one of the ones where you are, that adopted this system, instead of just going into the county election results web page and seeing your results, you now, when you go to your county web page, you get a page that looks like the Secretary of State of Georgia. However, if you look up in the URL, you see that the page is actually coming from SOE Software, which is out of Tampa, Florida, and that's owned by, as you said, a Spanish conglomerate named Seidel. So what they're doing, I'm sorry.
And isn't that a privately owned company? And we don't have any proof of this, but we've heard rumors that George Soros is the major investor in that company.
Yeah, that's a good possibility. I have not traced the ownership on that. But here's the flaw in it. If you ask the Secretary of State, I'm sure he will say, oh, but they are not actually counting the votes. They're not tabulating. They're just publishing the results. Now, technically, that is true. However, what he won't say, and where the real problem is, that during that upload, the county servers are open for hacking by SOE Software. And at that time, the results could be manipulated by them on the county servers or through some type of a virus that could be introduced during the upload. And thus the results of the counties who can actually be corrupted by this publishing house. So there's a huge vulnerability.
And I understand there are 26 states, and this was as of last year, that are now using SOE and CITL to tabulate their results. Right,
and it's always interesting to say, as you said when you started this little segment, why did we need to do that? Why did we need to spend $250,000 to outsource our elections results publishing when it was doing just fine before?
And it's nothing more than a glorified electronic spreadsheet, isn't it, Garland?
Right. I don't see why the Secretary of State's office couldn't do that themselves and keep it in-house.
Well, I certainly can see why they would want to do it. If we're right that the vote isn't secure, you really want to have somebody else you can blame it on.
And
well,
it's hard to do an audit trail.
Mm-hmm.
Well, but so much is PR and perception, and in the Federalist Papers, Hamilton says the reason we don't have a co-presidency, we have a single presidency, is so that the voters can assign blame to the responsible party if there's something wrong in the executive. Well, we ought to be able to assign responsibility for the security of our ballots, but they're being passed through so many hands, and there's so many vulnerable areas that it would be hard to do and make it stick.
And why is a privately owned Spanish firm, how is it that they have the contract to do this?
They don't mind being blamed.
And make money at it. This would be a hard sell to make for anyone, I think, under normal circumstances. And I used to sell computer software to go into any Secretary of State's office and say, listen, you pay me $250,000 and I'll tabulate your election results. And the comment back would be, well, why? We've always done it, and we've done it very easily. We've done it well, and we've reported the counts on election night, with rare exception, when it extends into the next morning.
But what if you're not confident of those voting machines? And you don't have the guts that it takes to challenge whoever it is that's telling you have to use them?
And Christina, we probably should explain why we shouldn't feel confident in the machines. Basically, there's three fundamental problems. The voting machine results can't be verified, audited, or recounted properly. And by that I mean is that you as a voter, when you see these selections on the screen, you have no assurance that what you saw on the screen was actually recorded on the card that is used to tabulate your votes or inside the machine. The vote could have been corrupted before it was recorded. When the election officials publish the results, they can't audit those results. All they do is simply say, okay, here's what the machine said we counted, and that's what they certify. They have no way to know if what they're certifying is actually correct or not.
Garland, it's come out in the news, just in the last several days, not even a week, that NASA has contacted a lot of the software development companies, including Google and Yahoo, and demanded that they have a back door into the software that they can look and manipulate. Not only software, but the hardware computer chips as well. So why wouldn't we think that they have that same back door into the hardware and the software of the electronic voting machines, where those folks in government who always seem to know best can manipulate the results of our election? They are certainly no longer secure, but I'd like to have your insight on that.
Well, right. So, and you're referring to NSA.
That's correct, NSA.
Right. So, National Security Agency did that recently. I think you. And the thing that I think that we ought to also just keep under our hat and be thinking about is that it's a little known fact that both Google and Facebook were CIA funded in the very early stages of their existence.
I have heard that.
Yeah, in particular Google, and that leads me makes me very nervous. So I have tried to avoid them wherever possible, although it's almost impossible because they're everywhere, into everything.
Garland, not to get off the topic of beating up on the NSA because it's always fun, but going back to voting, one of the things that Barbara Simon said, this was her visit to Spartanburg was right before the election last year, and she said that her concern was that we could have a complete election meltdown if we had another, 2000, Florida in 2000 when they couldn't seem to get an accurate count, and there was a possibility of the state having to do a recount. If a state using these unverifiable voting machines was to, if the election came down to Virginia and Pennsylvania, say, in 2012, there'd be a catastrophe because there's no way to count the votes.
Well, that's right. There is no way to have a recount. That was the third point that I was going to make. So today on these unverifiable voting equipment, you basically can only reprint the previous unverifiable results. You cannot do a real recount on the machines. And as we learned when we took our case to court, the experts that we subpoenaed and deposed, acknowledged the fact that the so-called recount is always going to produce the same results.
Garland, would you speak to what you found out from the debug voting machines expert from the company shared on the security or lack of security on the voting machines?
Right. Well, we deposed the two leading directors of the Center of Election Systems and actually the director at that time, Ray Cobb, and also the professor, Britton Williams, who oversaw the implementation of the voting machines in Georgia in 2002. And their testimony was pretty fascinating. They obviously, one of them had obviously been coached by the Attorney General because they kind of changed their story once we were talking with them and then when we actually deposed them. But they were quite candid in general, acknowledging the fact that Georgia had no independent audit trail of each vote cast, as the law required at the time. And they acknowledged, again, that about the recount, there's no way to do a recount, and that if the voting machines swapped votes prior to recording, there would be no way to detect that. So basically, the elections officials at Kennesaw State, when put under oath, were, I thought, pretty truthful. So, however, again, the Supreme Court, the Fulton County Court just blew the case off. Basically, their conclusions that they made, they had 17 separate conclusions that had no basis in law or fact. So therefore, we appealed to the Georgia Supreme Court, and the Georgia Supreme Court ruled that the voter has to assume the risk of necessarily different procedures. As you were just saying, there are different procedures, one for absentee ballot, one for electronic voting. Our argument was that, first of all, they're not necessarily different, they're unnecessarily different. And if the voter has to assume the risk, then it's a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution.
Absolutely. Because not everybody can legally vote online, vote absentee. But there's a move towards getting rid of the concept of absentee ballots, because that is the people who want this system, this bad system, whoever they are, they can see that they've got a vulnerability there. It is a violation of equal protection. So the way to change that is to eliminate the concept of absentee ballots and go to extended voting periods.
Exactly.
Christina, along those lines, the listening audience may not be entirely aware that I ran for Congress last year in Georgia's 11th Congressional District. I lost in the primary, but I petitioned the court to allow a review of the absentee ballots. Those are hard copy ballots. We could not see the electronic votes, of course, because there's no way to view those. And legally, they would say you can't see those because of technical issues, which means you can't review it. So the Superior Court in Cobb County came out with an interesting ruling that I, as a candidate, had no right to review the hard copy ballots. So therefore, we have a government telling us, buying machines where you can't do an audit, you can't do a recount, and then when a legitimate candidate asks to review hard copy absentee ballots, the government says, you can't do that, and you must accept the number that we give you as the actual vote count. Comment, Garland.
Oh, this is Cobb County?
That's right.
Yes, and that's amazing. And what I wanted, the last point I wanted to make, Christina, before we leave the early voting thing, was that the reason they're moving towards early voting is because those cards are left open for the entire early voting period. So you've got to be very careful. I would never vote early voting, because during the entire early voting period, any card could be subject to manipulation because they're not closed out.
You need to explain that to the listening public.
So early, basically, when you go into early vote, they have to open a card, set it up and get it ready. They keep that card in a locked drawer and use it as you come in, day after day and even week after week.
And you're talking about the card that makes the software function?
The card that has the votes on it. They give you a card and you record your vote on that card. When you go in for early voting, if on an electronic machine, just like you do on election day, they give you a card, you put it in the machine, you cast your vote, and you give them the card back. Well, those cards are only open for one day on election day, but they are open for the entire early voting period, and they have your votes on them, and they are subject to manipulation for that entire period of time.
Oh, that's interesting. I did not know that.
Right.
So,
Garland.
Gee whiz.
Garland, if you would, unless you've got another supporting comment to make on that topic before we run out of time, you give talks on the voting machines to the public, and so everybody needs to know that Garland and his website is voterga.org. But Garland, you talk about the elections for the TSPA, Special Local Option Sales Tax in Cobb County, and the anomalies on the results that have come in a couple of different elections that just, quite frankly, is not statistically credible. Would you explain that, please?
Yeah, I sure will. And I want to get back to your point, Michael, about your situation when we close out, because that is really, really important, and we didn't give that enough time. But, yeah, I'll skip over to the Cobb Splash, which were amazing. There were two Cobb special purpose local option sales tax referendums, one in 2005 and one in 2011. Both of them were decided just by a very few votes, and they were blank voted ballots. They were in 2005. The referendum was decided by only 114 votes, but yet there were 285 blank voted ballots. So the thing to understand,
what does that mean, Garland? Blank voted ballots.
Okay, that means that the ballot was totally blank. So what that means is that a voter decided to come to the polls, stand in line, get their card, put it into the machine, get the ballot up, and then decide not to vote and take the card out and give it back. And
this was the only
after casting their ballot.
And this was the only issue on the ballot. So someone would have to drive down there intending to vote on this single issue. No other candidates, no other issues on the ballot except for this. And they put their card in the machine, and after they do that, they decide, I don't want to vote. They pull it out and walk away. Is that right?
Exactly, and as you said, Michael, that's the most important thing to know about this, is that it was the only thing on the ballot twice. There was no other races on the ballot of any kind, so therefore it's not just a normal undervote. What was recorded was a totally blank voted ballot. There were more of those than what the margin of victory was in 2005. That was by double, way more than double. And then again in 2011, the same thing happened. 95 blank voted ballots there, 79 was the margin of victory. This was out of 40,000 votes cast. And again, like the Alvin Green situation, a huge difference in the verifiable mail-in votes versus the unverifiable electronic votes, because the SPLOST went down to defeat by 9 points in the verifiable mail-in votes. But since the referendums carried in 2005 and 2011, a total of $1.4 billion was assessed against the people of Cobb County based on what is obvious to me were lost votes.
And we're looking at a couple of hundred votes where people put their cards in and then decided not to vote. Now, you might expect that one or two times. Even that would be peculiar. But a couple of hundred votes, hundreds of votes, where people decided that they did not want to vote at that point.
Right, 285 people in that highly controversial referendum went to the polls and allegedly decided not to vote.
Well, Garland, given what you know about these voting machines and your experience and your knowledge of voting behavior, what do you think could have happened?
Well, I believe that the votes were lost, and then the question becomes were they intentionally lost? And that's when it starts to get pretty ugly. It is, I think, the only reasonable explanation is that those voting machines were lost the vote. So the question is, why would they have lost the votes? Were they lost intentionally because they were manipulated, hacked in some way? Was the election rigged? those are serious questions that really cannot be answered because, as y'all explained in the opening of the show, there's no way to audit or verify the results cast on these types of unverifiable statewide voting equipment that is being used in Georgia, South Carolina, and Maryland, and a couple of other states.
Garland, do you get
reports? Christina, just 1 second, if you would. I'd like to invite the listeners to go to YouTube and then search on Princeton University and Diebold voting machines. Both the computer department and the math department, which is a world-class math department. I saw this on Fox and Friends several years ago, where the head of the math department stated that the students had discovered a flaw, that you could program, put a virus on the cards, insert it into the machine, and they would slant the vote in one direction. So they cast 5 votes for George Washington's, 0 for Benedict Arnold, and Benedict Arnold won 3-2.
Mm-hmm. That's
so,
right.
So when we look at what's the reality of this, and Princeton, of course, is a world-class math department, so you can go online at YouTube and see the results. Garland, we're about to run out of time. Do you have any additional comments that you would like to make?
Just the one. Well, first of all, I don't know if Christina had a follow-up, and then I just wanted to get back just for the last 30 seconds on your point. But Christina, did you have?
Well, I just wondered if you in Georgia, if you're seeing something that those of us who work the polls, have seen, which is people complaining that between the time they vote and the time they hit the red button to cast their vote, they see their votes change.
Yes, that is a frequent occurrence throughout the country, and it's called a calibration error. A lot of times the machines are not calibrated correctly, and you can see the vote. You'll cast it one way, and then it'll come up different because the screen is not calibrated properly to accept your vote. Those are the changes and switches that you can see. What scares me are the ones that you can't see.
I just don't see why we use these things at all.
Well, exactly. What is the real intent of getting these in the first place? And I guess that brings us back maybe to the closing point that I thought that Michael was getting to, and that was now, we've tried to go ahead and vote absentee ballot because at least we have some record of our vote. But now they are saying, and the court has ruled in Michael's case, that a candidate or even a member of the general public cannot view the ballots. It means simply to view them in the presence of elections officials. And so in other words, the government is going to tell us what the results are, and we cannot do anything about it. That is about as Stalin-esque as I think you could possibly get, and that's where we are today.
But it has all the appearances of being democratic.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And my request was that the ballots, stay within the possession of the Board of Elections, that we not even touch the ballots. They could move them just so we could see, and review the actual number count, so we wouldn't have to take the word of the government telling us the result. So as Stalin said, it matters little who votes. What really matters is he who counts the votes.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Any other parting comments before we wrap it up?
I want to thank Garland for pursuing this steadfastly over so many years. Thank you, Garland.
Garland has just been absolutely heroic. He works hard at this. He funded, and we had to raise money to take these courses to the Fulton County Superior Court and the Georgia Supreme Court. And we haven't even talked about the voter fraud that went on in an election where you merged test votes with real votes. And a lady, voting machine clerk by the name of help me out with her name, Garland. Laura Gallegos, and when she reported this, she was referred for criminal prosecution or criminal review to the state attorney general, and that sent a powerful message, and she lost her job, too. And she didn't have anything to do with it. She was just a whistleblower, but that sent out a strong message to all the voting machine clerks statewide. You want to blow the whistle on any irregularities that you see, you'll lose your job, and you could be prosecuted criminally. And with that, we'll be back next week, and we hope you found the show to be both informative and interesting. Please tell your friends about the show and where to find us, because if we're to turn our country around, it'll take all of us working together. My email address is mopitz@mindspring.com. Also, you'll see hear the recording of this show on decidingthevote.com. And Garland's website, this is such an important website, so please do write it down, is voterga.org. And Garland, thank you for all the hundreds and thousands of hours of time and effort that you put into this on behalf of Georgia's citizens, and the citizenry needs to contact their state representative and demand that we get rid of these voting machines, because nothing else that we do in politics, if we don't have an honest vote, will happen. So again, thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
That's our show, and this is Michael Opitz wishing you a blessed day. Remember, knowledge is power, and ignorance is slavery.